Daily Devotionals. I'm not a Southern Baptist, neither is Phil, and yet we talk about the Southern Baptist Convention, the SBC, quite a bit on this podcast because it is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. And because of its size, the SBC has a lot of influence and reflects a lot of what's really going on within evangelical America. The SBC has also been sending very mixed messages about the issue of race. On the one hand, some of its leaders have been trying to move beyond its racist heritage in order to bring reconciliation and unity to the church. But on the other hand, it's rejected some things like critical race theory and been highly critical of leaders who've embraced anything that looks at all progressive politically. Recently, some of the SBC's most visible and gifted African American leaders have chosen to leave the denomination. One of them is Charlie Dates. He's been on our podcast before. He's a friend of ours and a fellow Chicagoan. Dr. Charlie Dates is the senior pastor of Chicago's Progressive Baptist Church. He's also an affiliate professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which is where I went to seminary. He's written and contributed to a number of books, and he's just one of the sharpest thinkers in the church today, bringing a deep commitment to the authority of Scripture and a deep understanding of this cultural moment into his preaching and into his ministry. So we invited Charlie to come back on the show and talk to us about his own journey with the SBC in helping to lead his church into fellowship with that denomination, and then why he chose to leave. I think you'll find his thoughtfulness and depth really refreshing, and I think his experience will help you understand better what's really going on with America's largest Protestant denomination. So here is Dr. Charlie Dates. Charlie Dates, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Thank you, man. It's been a little while, but I'm glad y'all are having me back.
Yeah, how have you been? You surviving the pandemic?
We are doing okay. Family is very grateful. My mother passed last year during the pandemic, not COVID related, but nonetheless a seismic, life-marking kind of moment that was for us. And so really, in one sense, in view of that, man, super grateful. My wife and I are in that phase where we are caring now for her parents a bit more as we raise our own children. So
that's
doing all right.
Finding ourselves in that sandwich between the younger generation and the older generation. And during the pandemic, it's been incredibly stressful with kids at home and then caring for the health of our parents and worrying about that. So there's a lot of people who can relate to you in that front. So, Charlie, you are one of the more brilliant thinkers out there right now in our generation of Christian leaders. You are tackling the hard issues. You're one of those pastors who's not backing away from some of the more controversial stuff. And I've appreciated that so much about you. But you, in particular, wrote a piece, I think it was back in December.
Yeah, December 18th.
About the Southern Baptist Convention and some of your journey within the SBC over the last number of years. And I read it and thought, wow, this just encapsulates so much of what's going on right now. So I wanted to have you on to talk about that journey. And I think it might be instructive for a lot of people, whether they're SBC or not, in figuring out what's going on in so much of the American church today and the divides that we're experiencing and the attempts to overcome those divides. So let's get into that a little bit. Talk to me first about you and your congregation's journey toward the Southern Baptist Convention and what drew you into orbit with that denomination.
Yeah, so I think I got the bulk of the question as it glitched again. So let me start with a bit of our journey toward the SBC. I think that's what you were saying. So I have been invited by the grace of God for a number of years now, 15 that I could think of, to preach in non-predominantly Black and brown spaces. So just to think of that in terms of my formation, I would say 18 years now that I think about it, just being in a number of spots as a son of the Black church, as a pastor or pastoral apprentice for a while within the Black church context. I just got a chance to taste and see and feel, quite frankly, the distinctions within evangelicalism. And I should go on record to say what I understand evangelicalism to mean. It is a high view of Scripture that is not necessarily taking Scripture literally, but interpreting Scripture within its historical, grammatical, literary, and cultural context, applying it therein. A high view of Christ, those cardinal doctrines that say Christ is the only way to the Father, a high Trinitarian kind of gospel view, and a view that says that the gospel is not just God's saving message, but it's a mandate for the church to reach the world with that saving message, so as to win people to Christ. So a lot of those things, even in my formation, theological, academic formation, were really just affirmed from my growing up in our local Black church here in Chicago. But traveling in these different ethnic contexts, I started to see that the emphasis of those high views of Scripture, high view of Christ, and doctrines led to different points of application. So we had the same structural core beliefs, but we did not necessarily do the same thing with them. And so I started maybe about 6-7 years ago being invited to some of the universities within the Southern Baptist Convention. And we had started an African American church renewal residency. So I pastor a historic church in Chicago, which was in pretty rough shape when we came. I don't say that to any shame of the church or any glory to me. It just was, it had grown older. It had, by virtue of that, it really wasn't reaching the neighborhood anymore, just a number of those things. And so, but it was at one point a titan of a church, and we have been seeing God turn this thing around. And so I started to wonder, what might we do to help other churches like ours experience that kind of renewal and whatnot? And part of it was, if we could combine a program that helps students matriculate at schools that had a high view of Scripture and keep them in service to and reflection in the local Black church, we could probably churn out more pastors who could come into churches like this one and see God doing amazing work in the neighborhood. That's where the SBC comes in. We wanted to build this program, and we wanted some housing. So we were asking around with our home convention, which is the Progressive National Baptist Convention, and a few other agencies who could help us get some housing in Chicago. And it turns out that the SBC was willing to help us get housing, long story short. So we brought on a resident and his wife, and we did that for a number of years. And I just started preaching in some of these circles. I preached at 4 of their seminaries. I got invitations to preach at 5 of the 6. I preached the pastors conference at the invitation of my friend, Pastor H.B. Charles Jr., and really just was warmly received, Sky, to be honest with you. So I came to our church and I said, because I believe in denominational work. And I said, guys, listen, I think I kind of turned in on my own church. Said, if we're going to have the most prophetic witness, then I think we should aim to have what's called dual affiliation. Stay with our home convention, but link up with the Illinois Baptist State Association, which is part of the SBC, and be a witness for Christ in a polarizing racial context.
And how was that received when people heard you say, hey, let's link arms with the SBC?
Yeah. So it was not taken very well by some, and understandably so. I mean, our people know the history. They've lived the history. This is a church of 5 generations. And so they said, Pastor, those people don't like us. They said they told Dr. King he was in sin. And it wasn't until recently that they apologized for affirming slavery. But even thereafter, they did not do much by way of reaching out to Black churches to live out that apology. And so one of them even said, we need to move from apologies to strategy. Like, what are we going to do to actually bridge the divide and to make changes happen? And so I told them, no, these guys are different. Of course you got the people of old, but that mentality no longer thrives in that community. And so I brought up people. I had gotten to know Steve Gaines and meet J.D. Greer, and HB's my buddy, and Matthew Hall at Southern Seminary, and Danny Aiken, just a number of them, man, who were very warm and kind. Ronnie Floyd, Kevin Ezell, very kind men. Um, and so I told our church, hey, look, let's do it. But we didn't do it right away. It took us
Well,
about 2 years.
back up a minute, because in the article you also mentioned the MLK 50 event that happened in
Yes.
Memphis, which
Yeah.
commemorated the 50th anniversary of his assassination, which was hosted by the SBC.
Yes.
So was that a symbolic event for you, or was it more meaningful that the SBC was the one actually commemorating MLK after, decades earlier having condemned him?
I thought and still do think under the leadership of Russell Moore, because that was the ERLC, that
Yeah.
it was meaningful. It was not merely symbolic. And I can tell you that it was meaningful because the conversations behind the scenes were jagged in one sense in terms of the disagreements within certain evangelical camps. It wasn't just the ERLC though; it's the Gospel Coalition as well, and then a number of others who were in that environment. And so there was a reckoning happening. And to be honest with you, when I walked into the convention hall that morning to give that address, it was with my wife. We were walking down the aisle, and I said, "Oh, I feel it. Like I'm in the space. I'm okay. Like I'm going to be able to say what I need to say." Because while writing the message, Sky, you can appreciate this, and knowing the groups that are inviting you, you can already be imagining in your head, this ain't gonna go over well.
Oh yeah, I've been there. I mean, not in the same sense that you were, but yes, I knew before I got on a platform, this is going to be my one and only time speaking here.
Yeah. So all I can tell you is before I even took my seat to get mic'd up, I knew that I was wrong because the energy was young, white Christians who had shown up and a number of Black ones who had shown up to kind of process what was going on here. And so I actually felt the freedom of the spirit to lean in to it a bit more. And so when I came home, check this, man, when I came home, the former chair of my trustee board, who is also the superintendent of our discipleship program, who also is a lifelong PMBCer, who also wanted nothing to do with the SBC. When I came home, he gave me a hero's welcome. Tears in his eyes at one point. This guy's in his late 70s, man, maybe early 80s. And so I felt like it was not only a meaningful moment there in Memphis, but I started to feel like it was a meaningful breakthrough here in Chicago.
So there was real hope that this is a new day and there's new opportunities to not just apologize, as someone said, but strategize together and work together. Okay.
Yes.
So
and I don't think, Sky, that there was this pie in the sky optimism. I think we knew it would be challenging, but I just saw from the opposition I anticipated there and the opposition I anticipated here that there was the possibility of some wonderful breakthrough.
It sounds like many of the people you mentioned, some of whom I know, some I don't, I would argue also they're very genuine. They definitely want to see that kind of work move forward. So when was the first time after you affiliated that you began to sense that maybe this marriage wasn't going to last?
Oh, yeah.
Right. When did you go, maybe I didn't get a full picture of what's really going on in the SBC world?
Yeah, I think so. I pause here because I don't want to say too much, but I also don't want to say too little. I preached the Expositor Summit at Southern Seminary in 2019, which is a wonderful meeting. And I got some time with Dr. Mohler, who I have a high regard for, quite frankly. And, Mohler is this kind of like culture warrior, a voice for conservatism in America, Christian conservatism. And so I thanked him for not coming out to back Mr. Trump in 2016. And that led to a conversation where I went on to ask him not to do it again. And aside from our disagreements about politics, my request, Sky, was based on the harm, very real harm and ideological harm that I felt like Mr. Trump proposed as a threat to Black and brown Christians. So I just did it on that ground.
Well, and the
And
fact that Al Mohler had not supported him in
say,
2016 didn't make it sound like an unusual request for you to, hey, just stay the course like you did 4 years ago, right?
yeah, yeah. And, politics, I was in a meeting recently, Lord have mercy. And because we air on a station, a rather conservative white station, and some of my comments, which I didn't even think were harsh, created a brouhaha. And one of the persons in the meeting said, with the Black church is like political. We know that it's more political, is what they said. And I thought to myself, well, surely not not more political than some people I have come to know and meet who are not Black pastors. So anyway, yeah, there is this kind of sense of, yeah, it's not merely political. So stay the course because there's something deeper here. But it ended up being about politics. And so that's when I saw the signs. It was like spring of last year. And I tell that story because when Dr. Mohler came out and said that he saw himself voting for the Republican Party for the rest of his life, basically, and really the Republican Party was a choice for Christians, I felt like he didn't hear me at all. And I, again, I have such high regard for Mohler. I tend to think of him as the titular head of the SBC. He may not be the president of the executive committee or the president of the convention just yet, but he has that kind of influence. And so I just thought, what a blatant disregard for a very real concern for Black and brown people and Black and brown Christians. And given that year too encapsulated George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others whose names down through the years we could call, that to me was the absolute, I want to be very careful. It was the grossest of disaffection. It was painful. And it harkened back to all of the history that I have read about the SBC. All of a sudden, those names and voices started to come alive to me that I'd only read in history books. And their staunch opposition to Black freedom and the liberation of Black bodies and Black people. And I know that my white conservative evangelical brothers and sisters may not read it the same way that I do, but they also don't live in this skin. And they don't have this experience. And a lot of them ain't even read a book on the Black experience. So for me, when that happened, I was wholly uncomfortable. And I didn't say anything. I mean, I called some people and I said, would y'all please call our mutual friend? And friend, he may think that's too strong of a word, but would you call our mutual acquaintance and ask him not to say these kinds of things? And then, man, on Reformation Day, he and the president were tweeting each other.
So when that happened, very often we have a bias towards what we want to be true, right? So, but when you encounter a bit of cognitive dissonance where something occurs that doesn't fit what you want to be true, we have a way of isolating it and excusing it. When Dr. Mohler had that conversation with you when he eventually came out and publicly endorsed Donald Trump, did you in your own mind go, okay, well, that's unfortunate, but it's just Dr. Mohler. It's not the whole SBC. It's that. Were you able to isolate that, or did it begin to seep out and change the way you were viewing the whole relationship with the SBC?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned it. I'm glad you mentioned it. Strangely enough, this is a coaster on my stand-up desk that I got at Southern. It's one of the buildings at Southern Seminary. I was thinking because I don't want to make this all about Dr. Mohler.
Right.
I want to be clear and say I think Dr. Mohler is doing what he thinks is the right thing to do, but I think his voice is representative, as he would say, of a more mainstream group within the SBC. And Doc is he's bold enough to say it. I represent what these people think by and large.
He is also seeking to become president of the SBC, which it's pretty hard to do if you are bucking what the majority of people within the denomination
Yeah.
think and
Yes.
believe politically.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, yeah. And so here's the deal. I want to be very clear in how I say this too, Sky. It just is what it is. So you talk about when do you come to that moment of realization? There's no hate in my heart. There is no love loss in this respect. It is what it is. They have shown me enough to know that the singers in my church were right. And
who was it? Maya Angelou or somebody said when somebody shows you who they are, believe them the first time.
Yeah.
Isn't that her? Yeah. So it sounds like you're right. The seniors in your congregation were correct. But to give you some credit here, your desire for reconciliation, to partner, to create a strategic alliance was built on that bridge of hopefulness that the future doesn't have to be bound by the past, right? We can go forward. And I applaud that optimism and hope, but I feel bad that it's been dashed.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, I think that future still is possible, but it's only possible right now. Like I think within the next 20, 25 years, it's only possible to the extent that the SBC is willing to purge itself of its greater evils, those lingering ideas and harmful thoughts regarding racism.
It feels like recently they're kind of purging in the opposite direction, though.
Oh, brother.
Like they're losing really gifted leaders of color like yourself and others who are leaving. And part of that was accelerated by the seminary presidents coming out with their statement about critical race theory or critical theory in general. Explain what impact that had coming after your conversations with Dr. Mohler and his endorsement of Donald Trump.
Yeah. And then again, on the whole Twitter piece on October 31st, Donald Trump, I don't think is a Republican. All right. Just let me say that. I think if you look at George W. Bush, if you look at his dad, if you look at Ronald Reagan, even Trump is something else. Yeah. So to have Republican convictions isn't really an issue, but to back that particular personality and to voice policy over personality said something different to me about the race category. So when the president's statement came out, it was in line with these other things, and it felt wholly unnecessary in the milieu that we find ourselves residing. It also felt like dog whistling, that this was being done to say to a certain swath or strand of conservatism, we hear you and we agree with you. So critical race theory, for those who know what it is and who do not merely point every angle of it toward evil.
Does anyone really know what it is?
Right. I mean, so like the scholarship on it is divided. The people who write about it and the lawyers who've practiced these critical legal studies, they don't all agree on what it is. But what we do know is that the precursor is in Thurgood Marshall and is in Thurgood Marshall's, Charles Hamilton Houston is in Thurgood Marshall's trainer, so that the systematic dismantling of segregation through the courts was done on the back of critical legal studies. And then you have the emergence of the civil rights movement, which takes a more populist approach outside of the courts and adds to this not only legislation, but demonstration. And they are all framing their work in the idea of structural injustice, that something is systematically arranged in American society to keep certain people on the margins. It's out of that critical race theory is born. Because what critical race theory wants to do is it wants to I'm going to use a word. I'm going to make up a word. It wants to create terms and a framework by which these things can be discussed in the courts, in government, and in society. And then it wants to systematically go after them. But because, a lot of people practice it can't agree, they don't fully know. Like it's not like the civil rights movement, but it is, in my opinion, it is born out of the civil rights movement and critical legal studies together, but it doesn't capture them. And at the same time, it's not anti like Dr. King in totality. So in my opinion, they were shooting at a straw man in one sense, but it hit us.
Yeah. So we had David Fitch on a few months ago to talk about critical race theory and critical theory in general. And he talked about viewing it as a tool, an instrument. And as an instrument, it can be used to uncover and diagnose real sin and injustice, or it can be used in an unhelpful way, in a harmful way, but it's a tool ultimately. But when I looked at the statement that came out from the SBC seminary presidents, what I can understand some of them expressing concern or some hesitation about the way critical theory is sometimes employed, whatever. But as a Christian leader in a denomination and looking at what are the things really plaguing, what are the temptations and false gospels and errors that are more prevalent within my community, it's pretty hard for me to make a case that the SBC is succumbing to some false vision of critical race theory, right? It seems like the far more pressing maladies are things like Christian nationalism and ongoing racism and seduction of political ideology and all kinds of other things that would be more pressing. It's like somebody coming to the doctor with a giant tumor growing out of the side of their body and the doctor being upset that they got a hangnail. Like, no, you deal with the thing that's going to kill them. You don't deal with the thing that's just an annoyance, right? So when you saw that statement and the way it came out, did you know right away that this is it? Like, we can't continue down this road in partnership? Or did you try to figure out a way to keep it going, but somehow extract yourself from some of the messier pieces of what was going on?
Right. So this to answer the question forthrightly, it was not just my decision. Our church has a plurality of leaders who have been tracking this throughout the year. And I would get occasional texts and say with links to articles before December, what's going on with this? Or what do you think about that? Or we need to hold our white evangelical brothers and sisters accountable, or other things. And so I did not know right away. I had to consult and just kind of feel out where our people were. And not only our leaders, but also some other highly respected Black pastors that I know whose churches are SBC. Mm-hmm. Just said, hey, this is what I'm thinking. This is what I'm feeling. I almost feel complicit at this point by just because race to me, abortion is the biggest thing to them. Race to me is huge. All right. And like racism is a deal breaker. So I'm listening to these older, wiser pastors, and a few of them are saying, yeah, I'm done too, or I'm considering. And so it became clear a few days later that we were not going to survive that particular treatise.
So when you and some of these other Black leaders announced that they were leaving or disassociating from the SBC, what kind of response did you get, whether publicly or even privately?
Well, first of all, my church and a number of personalities within my church have just said thank you. And so that's really in part what matters in this regard. And the response from around the country, some people were saying, we didn't even know you were in the SBC. That's because we weren't even, there that long.
Yeah.
And then others took it too far, in either direction. They were glad you're gone. Good riddance. I got, some of that kind of mail and DMs and that kind of thing. And so and then some on the other hand were like, well, what took you so long? Why did you do it in the first place? So the response was broad and varied, but it was mainly, even from people within the SBC, white leaders within the SBC, it was mainly a we understand, which, there are leaders within the SBC who, to your point, are not only good people, but they are pushing against the very thing that I was pushing against. And they need to be encouraged and celebrated and applauded. So it's not the totality of the SBC that is a problem. I really do think that people like J.D. Greer and Russell Moore and Matt Hall and others are, and Adron Robinson, of course, who's there, and Dwight McKissick, and Ronnie Floyd. Some of those personalities are a bit more sensitive to the plight of Black and brown people and can read this moment for what it is.
Do you think that they have enough support within the SBC over time to actually turn this ship, or you tried it, many others tried it over the course of recent years, and it feels like they went hard back the other way? I've talked to so many Christians over the years, to bring it down to a much lower altitude, who are in a local church or a denomination that they struggle with in some way, whether doctrinally or missiologically. And they have come to me and said, when do I know it's time to leave? And when do I stay, right? When do I continue to try to push things in a right, healthy, godly direction? And when do I go, enough's enough, kick the dust off my feet and move on? Like, you and some other leaders decided with the SBC, we need to disassociate, move on. There are some who are staying there, like the leaders you mentioned, but do they actually have a shot at this, at changing things? Or do you think it's they're throwing their pearls to swine?
I think the gospel compels me to believe that there is hope. Absolutely. I think as long as the Spirit of God is in the earth and we're living and breathing, yes. I just don't know that it's my assignment from God right now to forge ahead with that, because my sense of conviction is, and I didn't give it to myself, Sky, but my sense of conviction on the matters of race and Christianity are high. And it's, you ever been in a room where something really matters to you? It matters to other people, but it really matters to you. Like you're in tears and they're just sitting there sad. That's kind of how I feel in some of these conversations. This isn't just a political matter or let's turn the ship real slowly kind of piece. This is the witness of the church. And really, I think the salvation of the church in America as we know it, it's around race. And this isn't the kind of thing that the largest Protestant body in America can just casually get to when it's ready, or move in the opposite direction. So I want to spend my years, as Lord willing, God shall give them to me, and the decade scores in front of me, in the places that will bear the most fruit. And I just don't know that the SBC is there right now. I guess we'll see this summer. My friend, more so mentor, Dwight McKissick, who's been in this fight for 45 years now, has some stuff he's looking for by this summer, which I don't know that he's going to get. But if the SBC loses someone like a Dwight McKissick, that's a mighty tree that leaves the forest. And so I don't know, but I do have hope.
It feels a little bit to me like a repeat of the conservative insurgency that happened in the SBC decades ago, when people like Dr. Al Mohler and others really took a prominent place, where there was this purging of anybody who held to more progressive theology. It was just expunged from the SBC, and it really doubled down. But what's going on now, it's not so much a theological insurgency as it is a political and cultural and racial one.
Yeah.
And
it's the other CRT. It's the conservative resurgence theory.
Well put. Yeah. But if they succeed in that, and they lose the kinds of leaders like you're talking about, and Dwight McKissick and others, like, that's it. Like, game over. They are, for the next generation, committed to not just being in the room and not and feeling sad about racism, whereas you feel it more but like being actively opposed to the feelings that you and others like us have on this issue as being critical to the faith and the church in America. Like that feels pretty tragic to me, given the progress that it seems had been happening in recent years.
Yeah. I I think Sky, and can you hear me by the way?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I I think that the difference between now and then is that America is different. The the demographics are different. Um, we are swiftly moving to the point where white Americans will no longer be the majority ethnicity here in the United States. And so, who's going to populate these schools? Who's actually going to go to these seminaries? Do does do the six seminary presidents actually think that signing that statement is going to bring more African American students who come from the indigenous black church or black community, or are they banking on getting more African American students who already align sociologically and politically with their beliefs? And what I think is, in the changing landscape of America, it will actually weaken those schools, and it very possibly can weaken that convention without tearing down these racial barriers and divisions. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what you're getting, you kind of turned a corner here, because on one front, you really want Christian leaders to tackle the issue of racism for the right reason, because it's just the right, moral, godly, gospel thing to do. But if they won't do it for the right reason, some of us are okay with them doing it for the wrong reason, which is just the pragmatism of money, right? The demographic changes that are happening, the reality that your institutions and schools and seminaries and churches aren't going to survive if they are not engaging people of color, given the realities of where America's going, the browning of America. But I mean, I remember reading something that Dr. King said about some of the protests, the bus boycott, back in 1956. It was, you want white people to end segregation for the right reason, but if they won't, let's hit them in the pocketbook and withhold our money from the buses and things like that. And that might motivate them to do the right thing if it's for the wrong reason. And I feel like that's almost where we're at with some of what's going on in the white evangelical church, where for decades, leaders have resisted doing the right thing for the right reason. And now we're like, okay, well, then just do the right thing for the wrong reason. We're okay with, like, are we willing to settle for that? And that's the part that I find so just bewildering. Like, I remember John Ortberg saying that every organization has its mission and then it has its shadow mission. And the shadow mission for so many Christian ministries is just survival, like just economic and institutional survival. And it seems like even on that level, the SBC is being really short-sighted, because economic and institutional survival would mean a practical approach to the diversification of their conference. And yet they're shooting themselves in the foot even there, just like the Republican Party is doing that with, doubling down on white nationalism rather than appealing to Asian voters, Latino voters, African-American voters. Like, they're making no inroads with those groups. And it seems like demographic suicide. So what do you think on that front? Like, is there any hope that some of these groups will do the right thing for the wrong reason, if not the right reason?
Well, so again, Sky, I do think that there's hope, but I think what we're seeing is the true heart of these organizations. That maybe it was never really about gospel-centered reconciliation. Maybe it was more so about another gospel where you have to be like me and you have to think like me politically and sociologically. And that is the litmus test as to whether or not you have the real gospel. Paul says in Galatians, if me or anybody else comes to preach a different gospel to you, don't believe it. And the problem in America, I think, even with some of these conservative groups, is that they actually have morphed a real handle on the real gospel, or at least they're showing us that their handle on the real gospel is infected with something else.
Yeah.
So from
Paul's a great example. Galatians is a great example. You had these Jewish believers who were telling Gentile believers, you can come in and be with us, but you need to get circumcised, you need to have a Jewish diet, you need to practice these Jewish customs, which was their way of saying what really unites us is Jewish tradition, not the cross. And some of these predominantly white evangelical groups are saying to Christians of color, you can come in and be a part of us, but you got to be conservative politically. You got to hold to certain values and ideas that may contradict your own Christian experience and tradition, because what unites us is not the cross, it's white conservative American culture.
Yes. No, you said it better than I did. So I don't think to that point, there is reason toward doing the right thing for the wrong reason. And I do think too, you can be so rich and so wealthy that your money barricades you against doing the right thing. And the system is bent in your favor. So I don't even know how much they care about the next 2 to 3 generations and what they will inherit, because they have some insulation.
Yeah. How true is that? Easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, right? Might say a rich denomination.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, Charlie, thank you for writing the piece. We'll link people to it. Thank you for just your model of wisdom, both wisdom in moving toward the SBC and the wisdom in which you handled moving away from them.
I'm glad you think of it as such.
Well, no, but here's one of the things that stood out to me is throughout the conversation and you retelling the story, you kept referring back to conversations you had with wise members of your church, and other wise leaders. And I think we don't pay enough attention to that and the importance of perspective that we get from discussing these things broadly with people who care for us and love us and have a long history and understanding of these things. More of us need to do that and not rely just on our own instincts here. But
well, let me say this too, Sky, and I could use your help on this. I'm rounding the corner on this book I've been working on for a while called What Hath Justice to Do with Righteousness? I'm trying to crystallize these ideas biblically, theologically, and socially to help tender-hearted people. I'm not talking about the hard-hearted folks.
Sure.
But tender-hearted people read the world and let Scripture interpret us from its rightful justice lens. And so the issue is I preach every week. And so, I'm slow on writing anything else. And I teach classes at schools and whatnot. But that is coming, because I think we need to leave on record for succeeding generations what might be a more biblically faithful response than what we're seeing today.
Yeah, that's one. I look forward to seeing it, because I think even for the younger Christians or people coming up in the generations behind us, they can't always articulate it, but they have an instinctual desire to see that kind of integrated faith. Yeah. And it's the older generation that's disintegrated it, but they have more voices like yours and what we try to present on this podcast that presents a holistic, integrated vision of what God is redeeming in the world, including the systems. That's what's going to be the future of the church. And combine that with a high view of Scripture, like you said, a belief in a high Christology. That's what we're looking for. And that's what I think younger people are going to respond to. So I can't wait to see it. When is that book supposed to be done?
It was supposed to be done last year. So I'm on chapter 4 of 6 chapters. And so the chapter I'm on right now is actually, I don't want to say what it's called because I don't want people to, but it's explaining the first time I heard the word social gospel and how it was foreign to me, not only because of where I heard it, but the way it was being talked about.
Yeah, it was an insult, right?
It was a veiled threat. And I didn't even know it. I was just like, what are we doing here? And so that's where I am now.
I look forward. That's going to be fantastic. We'll definitely have you back on to talk about it. Maybe we'll have you on 6 times to talk about each chapter.
And I'd love it. Anytime y'all will. Really appreciate your work, Sky, and grateful for your ministry.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Have a good one.
Thank you, buddy.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Sky Pilot Media, that's Sky's company. Production assistant